But how would you define Jewish self-hatred, and what is that relationship to anti-Semitism?
Well, if you live in a world in which people hate Jews and you have to live in that world, one of the things you might do, you don't have to do, is to actually integrate into the way you see yourself as a Jew some of the senses of what an anti Semite projects onto a Jew.
Okay. Um, so, and where your book is greatly in depth, but where, in synopsis, where does Jewish self-hatred come from? Which is to ask, what is your book about? What is the synopsis? And what are the reasons for it?
Well, Jewish self hatred is a phenomenon which we clearly have in the West with the rise of Christianity. Christianity places itself as the substitute for the antithesis of Judaism, and the Christian therefore substitutes for the Jew. The Jew is therefore seen in Christianity as someone who is backward, negative, blind, and cannot see. And when Jews, certainly starting in the Middle Ages, already in the 7th century, started to try to live in this Christian world, one of the things they wound up doing was basically identifying with the negative image of the Jew. Now, it didn't mean that everybody who was Jewish did, and it didn't mean, by the way, that all Christians were anti Semites. But it did mean that one of the coping mechanisms of living in a world that is hostile is to identify with the aggressor.
That's the question I want to ask later. The
Good.
identifying with the aggressor. Can you
Good.
elaborate on that?
Well, Anna Freud, many years ago, had an interesting experience. She was running a clinic in London for children, many of whom had escaped from Nazi Germany. And she observed them playing games. Kids play games. And they played Nazis and Jews. But all these little Jewish kids wanted to play Nazis. That is, they didn't want to be the victims. They wanted to be brutal about it, the victimizers. And that is what identification with the aggressor is all about.
That's an interesting segue. Let me flip that around. I'm online. I want to ask you this a little further, but I'll ask it now. You were interviewed, probably in many contexts, but there was a Jewish journal that interviewed you about. Um, so journalist Deborah Nussbaum wrote. She says there have been dozens of cases like Marshak's. This is the cases where Jewish individuals are writing swastikas on their own doors, and
Right.
there's a bunch of them apparently. And I asked, so this is a quote that is attributed to you. There have been dozens of cases like Marshak's in the last few years, says Sandra Gilman. It's the self-creation of victim status. People who do this, like Marshak, need to see oneself as a victim equivalent to other victims. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, this is, set that over again. The idea that victims are created is, in point of fact, part and parcel of the psychology of victimization. That is, Jews who live in a society where anti Semitism is a peripheral fact, such as the United States in the 21st century, tend to identify with Jews, for example, in the time of the Holocaust. What is interesting, of course, is that there are a very small number of Jews who kind of create an atmosphere. They'll be college students who draw swastikas on the walls of their dormitories and claim, in point of fact, that they're the victims of anti Semitic outrage. There are enough real anti Semitic outrages that we don't need this, but this has to do with the notion of becoming a victim in a world in which victims have a certain cachet. In the United States, being a victim is not always a bad thing.
Okay. Furthering, there was a few points made here in
Yeah,
this article. I'd just like your take on each.
yeah,
This article goes on to say, and it quotes you further in theory.
yeah.
In a college culture, victimization is the common coin of the realm where people think about victims, and Jews are both the ultimate victim and yet in America not thought to be real victims. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, certainly in the last decade, the question of a society which is trying to rectify real injustices, the legacy of slavery, for example. And I will also add the refusal during the Holocaust for the United States to do anything proactive vis-a-vis potential victims and real victims of the Holocaust, has meant that identification with the victim is something which is positive, that is probably a good thing. The difficulty is if you don't fall into a category that is a quote unquote victim category. Jews in the 21st century are both seen as Jews in the Holocaust, that is, having the legacy of probably the worst genocide on record, but also as being the most successful American minority. Jews in the United States, in a sense, have both statuses, and that makes it very, very difficult for some young Jews to do anything but identify with their victim status in a society in which the victim status is primary, but the successful minority status is seen to be suspicious.
A third part of this article, if I may further it, he says, so the article says, Professor Gilman says, that it reflects a lessening of true anti-Semitism in society, and they quote you here in theory. The rarer the anti-Semitism, the more often this occurs, Gilman says, because of the reliance among some Jews on status as victim for their identification. This pair, you touched on it a little bit, but could you elaborate on this?
Well, one of the things that has clearly happened, and it's happened in a very interesting way, certainly over the last 20 years, is that anti Semitism has become a rhetorical factor in American Jewish life as the overall incidents of anti Semitism have become more and more infrequent. Now, I know that the Anti Defamation League runs every year a kind of catalog of anti Semitic acts. And in point of fact, over the last few years, there's been an increase in these acts. But if you spread those acts over the last 20 years, they're still very, very infrequent. Most Jews don't confront outright, especially violent anti Semitism, even though it can and does exist. So the less the anti Semitism, the more it becomes, in a sense, almost imperative to identify with the Jew as the victim of anti Semitism. And in a sense, of course, the Anti Defamation League of the B'nai B'rith has made this its mission to make sure that anti Semitism does not disappear as one of the status of being a victim. And as I've said, there is a reality there too that should not be ignored.
To segue, along these lines, I've read there's some concern by some Jewish authors that the Jewish community these days might actually need the threat of anti-Semitism to hold the diverse, atheists and Orthodox together as Jews. Do you buy into that, or what's your take of that kind of view?
Well, certainly there are organizational reasons in the West, and by the way, not just the United States, why combating anti-Semitism becomes, in a sense, the glue for organizing common purpose. And with the rise of Islamic anti-Semitism in the public sphere, certainly since 9/11, certainly since 9/11, and tied very much to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this has become a real issue. Now, what one also has to say is that while these incidents take place, they are relatively infrequent if one measures them against incidents, for example, in Germany against Turks, in England against other minorities such as Afro Caribbeans, and in the United States in terms of violence against African Americans.
Um, Continuing along with this, in terms of the victim issue, all this, how does the Holocaust today inform modern Jewish identity? I've asked a few people this.
Well, I think the Holocaust remains certainly for even the youngest generation of the 21st century a touchstone for understanding the Jewish past. It's interesting to me that given the fact that Tanakh, the Old Testament, as we speak of it in the West, is a history book. That is, it is an account of Jewish history, whether mythic or real, in which the centerpiece are events like the going out from Egypt, the giving of the Ten Commandments. The Holocaust, in a sense, has become equally important, if not more important, in understanding the Jewish past. I think this has to do also with, first of all, the enormous tragedy of the genocide against the Jews, but also the fact that it is, like it or not, as all historical events, going to recede as living survivors of the Holocaust and their children are no longer present in our society.
You touched on something there. Going back into Jewish history, literal or myth,
Yeah.
whatever. Um, Particularly the Old Testament, the Torah. Uh, there are a lot of Amalek. There are persecution, low
Mm-hmm.
persecution quality. The Queen Esther, the story of being persecuted by Haman.
Yeah.
So there's touchstones of this persecution thing, victim thing, going way back in Jewish history. What can you say about that in terms of the collective psychology as it informs all these issues we're discussing?
Well, certainly the narratives of Tanakh, of the Old Testament, deal in part, and they're not exclusively, with, in point of fact, the Jews establishing themselves as a people, as a religion, in opposition to others that did not want this to happen. The persecutions by the Pharaoh in Egypt, the persecutions in Persia, which are recounted in the book of Esther, are these accounts. Now, that is not obviously the entirety of the Old Testament, but they serve as a kind of paradigm for understanding Jewish victimization. And again, it isn't that such victimization didn't occur. One has to stress this. There is a kind of kernel of truth in this, especially from the Middle Ages through to the 20th century. But that this is understood then as a sort of paradigm which repeats itself over and over again in Jewish history. By the way, the Jews are not unique in this. One of the narratives which is quite fascinating in Chinese history, from the establishment of modern China in the beginning of the 20th century, is the notion of Chinese victimization, which goes back as far as one can draw Chinese history, and the notion that the Chinese are always the victims of colonial powers, of invading powers, from the Mongols, right, up through the British, is part and parcel of, even today, the central narrative of modern Chinese history.
Do you have any notion or thoughts on perspective on how the Holocaust does or did play in the context of self-hatred? And what I have in mind is I've heard that say for in Israel for many years the Israelis shunned the
Mhm.
Holocaust survivors, and is that part of the paradigm here, the self-hatred, or how would you frame all that?
Well, one of the aspects of Jewish self hatred which interested me is that, for the most part, and again, there are always exceptions, most people whom one can think about as true self haters who are Jews always split themselves off from the Jews they hate. That is, there always is a subcategory. So, acculturated Western Jews in Berlin weren't terribly fond, for the most part, of Eastern religiously Orthodox Jews. One could argue that their own anxiety about their status as Western Jews was projected then onto Eastern Jews. Now, it's very clear that after the Holocaust, not just in Israel, but also, for example, in the United States, in Australia, in Britain, Holocaust survivors were oftentimes as seen as um, people who one didn't want to evoke in their status as survivors because one then put one's own survival into question. Philip Roth talks about this all the time, how he, as an American Jew who was alive at the time of the Holocaust, a boy, was very anxious after the war about Holocaust survivors because they pointed out the fact that he too could have been a victim had he lived in Germany or Russia.
Could you discuss the idea, the argument, I guess it's mainly a Zionist argument, but probably not only, that Jews in the diaspora by definition are psychologically marred and prevented from being fully Jewish?
Well, the notion that Jewish self-hatred only has a negative outcome is also not true. That is, Freud talks about both repression and sublimation. That is, you can repress your anxiety about your status as the Jew, but you also can sublimate it into works of great creativity. In fact, the origins of Zionism, the figure of Theodor Herzl, is a beautiful example of someone who took his anxiety about his status as a Viennese Jew in the 1880s and 1890s and transmuted it into the creation of the idea of a modern Zionist state.
You talk elsewhere about Max Nordau in your book,
Yeah,
and the idea of, you call it the muscle Jew, which is kind of created to dismiss the ghetto
yeah,
degenerate Jew.
yeah.
Could you elaborate on those
Sure,
polarizations?
sure. In early Zionism, the most important supporter of Theodor Herzl was a Parisian intellectual physician by the name of Max Nordau. And Max Nordau was the sort of hot writer of the 1890s. His book on degeneration was translated into every possible Western language. Nordau, in one of his early talks to the Zionist International Conference, talked about the need for Jews in the ghettos in the East to transform their bodies from being sickly, of being urban, to being healthy, and to being agricultural. Indeed, the whole fantasy of the Sabra, of the modern Israeli, is in point of fact the living out of Max Nordau's notion of the necessary transformation of Jews like him, urban Jews, intellectuals, into healthy, muscular Jews. And Nordau uses the wonderful term muscular Judaism, Muskeljudentum, which is absolutely analogous, by the way, to Teddy Roosevelt's notion of a muscular Christianity, which was developed at the exact same moment.
Could you elaborate a little bit, please, on this conflict between Western Jewry and Eastern Jewry? What exactly was the objection? What, the caricatures, the stereotypes of the Eastern European Jews? Could you elaborate on that? What were
Sure.
those stereotypes?
Western Jews, and here I'm thinking about Jews in Berlin, in Vienna, in Paris, and in London. And here we have to think about the intellectual class. Were, for the most part, anxious about Eastern Jews, whom they saw as being backwards, religious primitives. Now, of course, many Eastern Jews in Warsaw, in Moscow, and in Petersburg shared that view because they were just as westernized as the Western Jews in Paris and in Berlin. These are stereotypes. They position the observer, the westernized Jew, as opposed to the Eastern Jew. And I can tell you, if you read Yiddish sources that are religious rather than secular, and most of the literary sources of the 19th and 20th century are secular, you find that Eastern European religious Jews have exactly the same stereotypical view of Western Jews, that they are a-religious, that they are too concerned with the material and not with the religious. So we have, in a sense, a kind of reciprocity of stereotypes. This, by the way, works its way out. This works its way out in 1944 and 1945, at the moment when Hungarian Jews are being deported for the first time to the death camps. When a Hungarian Orthodox rabbi says that the murder of the Jews is the result of their acculturation into Western society, which is, of course, blatant nonsense. It's the result of Nazi politics and race hatred.
Where do the Hasidics, the Hasids fit in this? I know you just mentioned Hungary, and I think
Yeah.
a huge proportion there. And this, again, this contest between the Hasids in the East, predominantly,
Yeah.
correct, and the West.
Well, there are, of course, different flavors of Jews in the East. There are ultra-religious groups who are westernizing. That is, they believe that religious Jews have to function in a secular world. There are ultra-religious Jews who see themselves as inherently separate, and we think of this always in terms of the various Hasidic rabbinic courts, but there too there's great variation between some of these courts which are much more worldly than others. The majority of Jews in the East, in point of fact, were like the majority of Jews all over the world. They were, in point of fact, working class. They attempted to live their lives as competently as they could in the world they found themselves in, and didn't give really much concern about fantasizing about whether or not Jews were positive or negative. They were more concerned with earning their daily bread.
Um, what about in Israel today? I know there's a lot. Does this fit into the self-hatred paradigm or not? The idea that the secular Israelis and the ultra-Orthodox are in all kinds of conflicts
Yeah.
all the time. Could you elaborate on what's going on
Well,
in the context of the things we've been saying?
if one looks at Israel in the 21st century, it looks as if we have a replay of Western secular Jewry versus Eastern ultra-Orthodox Jewry. In other words, that the stereotypes of 19th century Berlin and 19th century Minsk now live themselves out in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. The reality is that these images may be present, but they function in a very, very different historical context. And that's the context of a political state, the state of Israel, in which various groups are jockeying for political power in the real democracy of Israel. So, what was, in a sense, an acting out in a world in which Jews had relatively little power in the 19th and 20th century is, in point of fact, now of a very different nature, because the contestation between the religious and the secular, between the Yiddish speaking and the Hebrew speaking, between the descendants of North African Jews and the descendants of Western European Jews, and, needless to say, the new world of Russian Jewry in Israel, is a contestation about real power. And stereotypes, when they function in that context, are very different than stereotypes that functioned in the historical past.
Would you say, in the context of Israel, the issue of self-hatred, then it seems to be suggesting that that's pretty much been erased, that that's not really a factor in the Israeli politics and the Israeli self-identity?
Well, one of the things that has happened with self-hatred, and my book is now about 25 years old, so I've actually experienced it, is that it has gone from being an analytic category that is trying to understand how individuals function in a complicated in a complicated world, to being simply a term of opprobrium, a curse word. If you don't like your enemy, he is a Jewish self-hater. And by the way, I've heard this spoken in the mouths of religious people about secular people. I've heard it in the mouth of secular people about religious people. I've heard it in the mouths of the left about the right in Israel, and vice versa. The irony, of course, is that Jewish self-hatred, already in the 19th century, the first use we actually have of the phrase, was already a term of opprobrium. So in a sense, we've gone back to the 19th century notion that if you don't like what your enemy does and you think that this is a reflection on his Jewish identity, he's a Jewish self-hater.
Along these lines, I mean, it seems, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of this revolves around the politics, the pro and cons of the state of Israel. And Noam Chomsky seems to come up as the seminal individual, or one of them, in that realm. Could you, so the kind of politics that, in terms of Israel, that frame quote self-hater, could you elaborate on that?
Well, it strikes me that, again, the use of being a Jewish self-hater as a term of opprobrium has certainly now had a role in the debates about the nature of the state of Israel as seen from the diaspora. In other words, I think it has a different function in Israel and in Israeli politics, but certainly the debates in the United States and in Great Britain about people who support or don't support, who see critically or don't see critically, who see alternatives or don't see alternatives to the present state of Israel, plays out oftentimes with this hammer of, sorry, plays out with this hammer of calling your opponents self-haters. I think there is very, very little evidence in any of the cases, Noam Chomsky, or any of the other sort of leading figures, and I think also of the late historian Tony Judd, that they were in any way self-haters. They're critics of a specific position rather than putting themselves as separate from and better than other Jews.
Um, there's a quote that's on the internet quite a bit. I saw it's out of your book, and it's about this. And I wonder if what your take is still on this, if it's changed or not. You say one of the most recent forms of Jewish self-hatred is the virulent Jewish opposition to the existence of the state of Israel, which funnels into what we were talking about.
Yeah. Well, again, I think that one has to be very, very careful about making blanket statements about the motivation for the opposition to any political position. Uh, Certainly, you will find people who are over the top in terms of their rhetoric about Israel. Whether or not this is an attempt to distance themselves as Jews from other Jews, or whether or not this is the expression of a political position which they feel vehemently, is something which is impossible to judge on the surface. I tend to be very, very careful. I tend to be careful about any people who are ideologues because I understand that they are ideologues without wanting to analyze, without knowing who they are in great depth, what their motivation is.
How would you define anti-Semitism? What would your definition be?
Anti-Semitism is, in a sense, the easiest thing to define, and sadly also the easiest thing to see. It is the creation of a category called the Jews and the ascription to this category of a whole range of qualities. Some of them negative. Jews are avaricious. Jews are conspiratorial. Some of them seemingly positive. Jews are very smart. And in point of fact, when you start to actually ask what very smart means, you wind up seeing that Jews are simply considered to be clever. The people who are put into that category, by the way, can be a very motley crew. They can be Christians. The Nazis put a number of Christian writers on the list and simply labeled them as unacceptable as Jews, even though they had no Jewish identity or, by the way, Jewish parentage or grandparentage. And today, too, anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism can be judged when people speak about the Jews as a blanket category.
You touched on philo-Semitism. Could you elaborate on that? I've seen some critics of that also.
Well, philo-Semitism is simply the other side of the coin of anti-Semitism. If anti-Semitism says all Jews are bad, all Jews are bad, philo-Semitism says all Jews are good. And the answer is all Jews, each individual Jew, each individual who is considered to be Jewish has their own qualities, and those qualities are very difficult to lump. But the lumpers, right, the lumpers who speak about the Jews are the people one has to be very, very, very careful about.
The thing that throws me on this is there's a lot of individuals in the Jewish community who will say the Jews, and I think a lot of the protectorate, like the ADL, the protectorates of the Jews.
Yeah.
Could you
I,
elaborate on that?
I'm very anxious even when Jews speak about the Jews, because then when you start to have conversations, they will then say, oh, I mean Jews in the religious sense, or even more narrowly, Jews in my sense of what an appropriate religious identity is, or maybe Jews as a civilization, or Jews as a culture, or Jews as an ethnicity. And then when you start to realize that there isn't even a clarity when Jews use the term the Jews, one wants to be very anxious about this notion that the Jews have a character. The Jews have a even communal history. Northern African Jews and the Jews of Kazakhstan and the Jews of Australia may all be quote unquote Jews, but they all may have very, very different histories.
One aside before we move on. Thank you for your time on this, and you're great. The issue of generalizations. What we talk about now is
Yeah.
generalizations, and you know, is there such a thing as a valid generalization, as an anti-Semite, as a philo-Semite, anything in between? What's your take on that?
Well,
I'm asking easy questions.
yeah, the joke answer about generalizations is that all generalizations are bad, even this one, right? So that it's a really tricky question to ask about generalizations. The sociologists always claim that all generalizations, all stereotypes, have a so-called kernel of truth. That is, if you go back far enough, you will find something in the actual activities and existence of any group that triggers the generalization. My sense is, and again, I'm a historian, is that sometimes that's true and sometimes it's not true. I'll give you a specific example. The late 19th century has one of the standard stereotypes of the Jew, the Jewish banker, right? Very, very few heads of major banks in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and in the 21st century were, in point of fact, Jews. That's actually the exception to the rule. The other stereotype of the late 19th century is that the Jews were all revolutionaries. And one of the interesting questions there, and one asks it always about the rise of Soviet Union, is why is it that so many communists were Jews and so few Jews in Russia became communists, right? The answer is there are kind of kernels of truths, but oftentimes that kernel of truth is in the imagination of those who make the generalization rather than the lived experience of those who are labeled as Jews.
On the side, please. I've read.
Sorry, we never get phone calls.
I'm a jinx.
Yeah.
I've
Sorry.
read that in traditional rabbinic Judaism, a Jewish individual who is born Jewish, no matter what he or she does, become a Christian, a Buddhist, whatever, still is a Jewish. The idea that one can't escape being Jewish. Could you elaborate in terms of self-hatred, in terms of the paradigm of all that? How does that play into it? Or
Well,
does it?
well, there is a notion which is an idea in rabbinic Judaism about inheritance. That is, one has to have one's mother being Jewish in order to be born Jewish. By the way, very different than in the Bible, where it is patrilineal. That is, you were Jewish if your father was Jewish. Um, Moses marries a Midianite, right? Moses, who is Jewish, marries a non-Jew. His children are Jews. Um, and so the question then of inheritance is a very complicated question. Uh, can one stop being Jewish? Well, that's a very interesting question. Um, if you think of this as a negative quality, the answer is, well, you can always label people. If you think of it as a positive quality, again, you think that this is something which, in a sense, ties one to one's ancestry. There are lots and lots of ways of imagining being Jewish that have absolutely nothing to do with inheritance. And indeed, in Reform Jewry, certainly over the last two generations, the number of young Reformed Jews whose parents, one parent or the other, is non-Jewish and does not convert to Judaism, but who becomes part of the Jewish community, has been incredibly high. Are these young people Jewish? They certainly are in terms of their membership in their congregation, their own sense of identity. Have they an inheritance of Judaism? Well, if they have one parent, perhaps they do, but that isn't what is central for them.
I want to just give you easy questions
I,
here.
I caught that.
Aviv,
Yeah,
I have another very
yeah.
easy question for you, and it's about as general questions I can land it. In 2010, who or what is a Jew?
Oh, who is a Jew? This is, of course, one of the key questions. I always turn it around and I always say that the person is a Jew who sees themselves as a Jew in whatever configuration they find themselves. Not necessarily in terms of religious identity, perhaps in terms of family ancestry, in terms of social good and social goal. So I think of it as very much a set of individual choices. I must admit that I'm an outlier in this because certainly religious Judaism has a finer distinction of who's a Jew. But even within Judaism as a religious practice, there are radical differences between the Orthodox, the conservative, and the Reform or liberal wings of Judaism.
In the general Jewish community, I've read, that being born Jewish is paramount for many people, and that the issue of conversion, I've read a number of things that for often converts have a difficult time in terms of getting to that threshold of the general community really embracing them as being genuinely Jewish, and that seems to have the birthright is the term comes
Yeah.
up. Could you address that, please?
Well, the question of conversion is an interesting one because conversion is a problem in all religions. Jews who converted to Christianity in the Middle Ages, right, were seen with a good deal of suspicion. Were they real converts? And the story is told of the dean of the cathedral at Cologne who dies, who's a convert to Christianity, um, and who says on his deathbed, I want a tombstone with a dog chasing a rabbit. And when asked why, he said, because a Jew can no more convert from being a Jew than a dog can change his habits and stop chasing rabbits. Now, that legend is a story which says Jewish converts cannot be trusted. And I think this is true in all religions. I think there's a certain suspicion about choice. But the other side of it is, of course, that many Jews did convert both to Catholicism and to Protestantism and have become part and parcel of Protestant and Catholic communities in Europe and in the United States. The Nazis tried to sort that out, oftentimes with great difficulty. Jews today, too, have questions about not the meaning of conversion. Every single Jewish group has the potential for conversion, different ways, different thinking about it. But then this question about the hesitancy of difference may come about. It may also not come about. One doesn't want to make global claims about anxieties about conversion, but those claims can be made.
What about that issue of birthright? Now, and the ancestral aspects, is it a racial aspect? The idea that the born Jew in the rabbinic world, in the traditional
Yeah.
Jewish, what exactly is that
Well,
about?
the notion that one has a birthright as a Jew comes from the notion of the inheritance of a tradition, right? If one wants to go back to the biblical forerunners, it had to do with what tribe that you were born into, right? Before the 10 tribes disappear, there are 12 possibilities to be born into various tribes, and that is part of one's identification as a Jew, right? But the way that inheritance is imagined, whether it is through the mother or through the father, changes over time, and what its implications are changes from religious um, structure to religious structure. Liberal Judaism, Reform Judaism has a very different attitude toward this notion of inheritance and birthright than does, let's say, ultra Orthodox Jewish practice. And indeed, the big debate in Israel around who is a Jew is not so much the question of secular versus religious, but the various strands of official religious belief in Israel, all of which calls itself Orthodox.
You brought up the subject in your book. Very all this is interesting, but you say, "quote The role of the Jewish convert to Christianity in attacking the Jews in the public forum cannot be underrated." And could you discuss that issue of Jewish converts in the medieval era, in particular, fomenting anti-Semitism or
You
contributing to it?
Well, one of the things that happens in the medieval and early modern Christian churches is the notion that converting a Jew, and usually it's a Jewish male, to Christianity meant that you had access to the inner secrets of Jewry. The fact that there are no inner secrets of Jewry didn't bother anybody, but that you had access. And very often, then, these converts became the point people, the visible face for attacks on Jewish practice and belief. Thus, the initial attacks on the Talmud as this secret text which was attacking the Jews, which is pure nonsense. Excuse me, as a secret text attacking Christians, which is pure nonsense. In point of fact, the Talmud is a compilation of legal views and legal comments on the laws, um, is spearheaded by a Jewish convert. In the 16th century, as part of the beginnings of the Reformation, we start to see Jewish converts who have Hebrew, who have Aramaic, be the point people on the attacks on the Jews from the standpoint of Luther on the one hand and the Catholic Church on the other. The convert, in a sense of which there are very few, or relatively few, becomes very much more important as figureheads, as individuals who gave true insight, now that they were Christians, into the nature of the Jews.
They had enormous or a significant amount then in fomenting anti-Semitism.
Well, the converts had a role in exacerbating attacks on the Jews, but the attacks on the Jews came out of either the Catholic Church or the evangelical church. In other words, it wasn't that these Jewish converts were the spur; they were, in a sense, the front people for these attacks.
Along these lines, you talk about Martin Luther, and in that context, you talk about elements, quote, elements used in thieves' cant laced with Hebrew, playing to the stereotypes in the era of Martin Luther. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, in the early modern period, Jews are outsiders. We're surprised by that, right? They live on the fringes of society in Europe. And there's a kind of bleeding among the various groups who are on the outside. One of the things that thieves do is they develop what's called a thieves' cant. By the way, we have it in the United States in terms of hobo language in the 19th and 20th century. And in Central Europe, the thieves can't pick up large amounts of Yiddish and Hebrew from the Jews, some of whom, by the way, were also members of these gangs. Why should Jews not be members of thieves' gangs in the early modern period, just as they are in Las Vegas in the early 20th century? Not all gangsters are Jews, but some gangsters are Jews. And so that thieves' cant becomes one of the ways that Western Europe imagines the way that Jews as criminals, rather than criminals as criminals, think and speak.
You were talking about, did you address the idea that converts were not trusted in the Marranos, so-called? Do you have much knowledge about them? Can you,
I've not worked in
okay,
Spain,
okay,
so I would prefer,
okay, okay.
yeah.
Um, you say, quote, this is a quote from the book, Jewish self-hatred has existed among Jews throughout their history. And the book discusses a lot of reasons why that is.
Yeah.
Could I ask you those for an overview of why?
Well, Jewish self-hatred is a manifestation of the interaction between a minority and a majority that has a very specific view of the way they think Jews are, and a minority of Jews who, in a sense, wanting now to become part of the majority, take over the attitudes, the fantasies of that majority toward the Jews. In a sense, they become better anti Semites than the anti Semites themselves. This is a phenomenon which starts in the Middle Ages, and it may also be a phenomenon of today. But these are exceptional cases. These are not the general criticisms of Judaism or Jewish thought or the state of Israel on the part of self-identified Jews.
Going back to your book again, a little more here. Could you discuss the notion of quote otherness in the Jewish self-haters in the struggle to win acceptance from the majority culture, the notion of being the outsider and all that?
Every society defines itself in that which it is not. I am French because I'm not German. I'm German because I'm not Jewish. At least historically, that was the case. And certainly, Christian society, from the Middle Ages on, whether it then is Catholicism or Protestantism, defines itself primarily in not being Jewish. Certainly, the New Testament is a document of how Jews become Christians and not Jews. So there's a kind of a textual base for this. So when one starts to think about Jewish self-hatred, it has to do with the notion that the Jews who are imagined as the antithesis of the Christian, wanting to become part of this world, wanting to leave their victim status, over-identify with the fantasy of the Jews held in Christianity. Now, this is not the case that every Christian sees every Jew in this way, but we can really talk, because we have textual evidence, of the power, for example, of the Gospels in shaping an idea of what the Jews are, which many Christians accept as a reality.
Again, another really broad, difficult question, but I'd like to just see where you go with it,
Yeah.
please. And that is, where do you draw the line? Where's the line drawn, you or anybody, for a self-hater? I mean, there's a whole continuum of criticism of Jews. I mean, where is it unjust and where is it just? I mean,
Yeah.
where is that point?
Well, the use of the phrase Jewish self-hatred as a weapon is for me not a very effective way of looking at human motivation. I think that one of the things I try to do in my own work is to examine specific cases of people who manifest what, at least on the surface, is a projection of Jewish stereotypes onto other Jews, and try to understand, for better or for worse, how that functions in those individuals' lives. I know on one level that's speculation, but I don't try to do it as a weapon, as a kind of cudgel to say that these are bad people or they're dumb people or that they're victims not recognizing their own victim status, but rather that they are people who are acting in such a way that they see as the only way they can function in the society in which they find themselves.
Um, if I ask you this, there's a lot of things that intrigue me. Again, I thank you. You're a very interesting man. This is interesting. What about the role of the Jewish American princess in the tradition of Jewish self-hatred? I'm calling it that. I don't think you did. I don't know. But where does that stereotype come from? And why is that kind of defamation institutionalized and accepted in the Jewish community?
Well, first of all, the notion of the Jewish American princess is simply a continuation of older stereotypes of the Jew, either as avaricious, right, as money grubbing, or as sexual or hypersexual or deviant in their sexuality. These are stereotypes that go back certainly to the Middle Ages. I mean, there's nothing new about that. What happens in the course of the 20th century is that the so-called Jewish American princess becomes a category in which one can defame a group which is seen as somehow or another, I would even argue, in rebellion. Stereotypes of women, never mind Jewish American princes, but of women, rise exponentially based on the demands that women have starting in the 19th century for political, social, and civic emancipation. So when one starts to think about stereotypes like the American, like the Jap, the Jewish American princess, um, which is then perhaps continued and exploited by, let us say, Jewish comics, most of whom are men. One can see then that being Jewish might also be gendered, that Jewish men have a different attitude toward Jewish women that Jewish women might have toward themselves.
Is a Jap, so-called, is that a manifestation of self-hatred in your view?
It's certainly that the Jewish American princess is a type of, in certain contexts, acceptable projection, right? Acceptable projection. But whether or not it is projection of the Jewish stereotype or the stereotype of the woman is an interesting question. In other words, are Jewish men acting out when they use this stereotype in terms of their own Jewish identity, or are they acting out in terms of their masculine identity?
There's a famous story told. I've seen it before, and your book mentions it too. Well, I looked at the gender book in Freud. There's a famous story about Freud's father having his hat knocked off, and by a non-Jew.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on the kind of psychological meanings to the
Yeah.
Jewish community in general and Freud? And
Well, the story that Freud himself tells, right? Freud himself tells about his father is that he had idealized his father, as all young men, he said, idealize their fathers, until one day when his father told him a story that when he was young, he was walking on the sidewalk in a small town in Bohemia, and an anti-Semite came up and knocked his hat off and knocked it into the gutter. And Freud says, instead of reacting and knocking the guy down, he steps off into the gutter and gets his hat. And Freud says, well, that shows that he, in a sense, was afraid, and parents and fathers should never be afraid. I think it's a more complicated story because, in point of fact, the whole notion of that type of confrontation we know, and we know a lot about, which is that that confrontation was played off usually in the following, is that a Jew is walking on a sidewalk. And remember, sidewalks are elevated because the streets are mud and they're full of horse manure. A non-Jew comes up and says, hep, hep. That was the call. And when the Jew hears hep, hep, he is to go to the back of the bus. He is to get off of the sidewalk and stand in the street so the non-Jew can pass. And very clearly what happened was that Freud's father refused to do it. And he had his hat knocked off, at which point he made a choice of, having made the confrontation, not continuing the confrontation. So, on the one hand, Freud sees it as a sort of cowardly act, but one can also see it as an act of resistance. It's an interesting question.
Could you discuss a number of famous self-haters, or so quote self-haters. Karl Marx comes up, and could you synopsize how he fits into the paradigm, what he argued, what he said too?
Well, Karl Marx is an interesting figure because Marx is a child convert. That is, if he is a Jew in any conscious way, it's from his earliest childhood. When he's a young adult, he writes an essay called On the Jewish Question, which is actually an attack on one of his socialist contemporaries. And what he says in it is that the Jew is, in a sense, the essence of capital, and that capital is what is wrong with the Western world. What Marx is saying is, of course, that the Jew, again, the stereotype of the Jew as a kind of collective, is the banker, is the exploiter, and that capitalism is, in a sense, a quote unquote Jewish invention. Now, Marx's projection of all of the anxieties he has about capital, about capitalism, about the economic system which is exploiting the worker, and this is a very young Marx, mind you, right, um, is projected now into a category from which he and his family had purposely distanced themselves. They had converted. His father had converted, and the father had the children converted. So I think in that case, without having to do a very close reading of On the Jewish Question, one can really talk about this as a moment, and a rather interesting moment, of the creation of this Jewish other, and a type of distancing all that Marx might have felt about his own sense of what is a Jew in terms of his own background onto this imaginary Jewish capitalist.
Another guy you mentioned is Otto Weininger,
Yeah.
and part of that realm has to do with the Jew's body as effeminate, and on and on and on. Could you synopsize that?
Well, in 1904, a young graduate student named Otto Weininger published a version of his dissertation. The book was called Sex and Character, and it became, by the way, for 20 years, one of the best-selling and most influential books in Western thought. Every major thinker, from Wittgenstein to D.H. Lawrence, used and believed what Weininger wrote. And what Weininger writes in this book is that Jews and women share certain qualities, and they're qualities of character and qualities of identity. And Weininger, himself Jewish, doesn't like those characteristics which he sees as either feminine or Jewish. And he creates in this book a notion of a kind of feminized Jewish male who has to be overcome to become healthy. Now, Weininger has great impact, and one has to stress this, because his argument, which is an interesting one, is that everyone, Jew and non-Jew, have a point in their character which is Jewish and a point which is non-Jewish. And the question is only, where are you on that spectrum of the Jew and the non-Jew? It isn't that the Jew and the non-Jew are antithetical, but their character traits. And Weininger's influence, as I've said, is incredibly great.
Now, from what you said, was that part of the Zionist purpose to destroy that, the effeminate Jew?
Well, Zionism is anxious, and certainly Max Nordau, as one of the early Zionists, is anxious about creating a Jew who is, in a sense, liberated, right? Nordau has a fantasy of the Jew as being weak, as being effeminate, as being a city dweller, as having intellectual rather than physical strengths. And what early Zionism wants to do is to turn the Jews into a people of great variety and to augment the intellectual with the farmer, to augment the city dweller with the country dweller. And so Zionism, by the way, as with every other national movement of the 19th century, every other nationalist movement of the 19th century, has a notion of a healthy, rural body, a body of the Czech, of the Jew, of the Pole that is close to the land and that draws its strength from the land. The difference, of course, is Zionism wants the Jew to go back to the original land, to go back to the Middle East, to what is Palestine in Jewish parlance of the 19th and early 20th century, while the Pole is quite happy to remain in Poland and the Czech to create the new state of Czechoslovakia.
You mentioned Karl Kraus comes up, and the thing that's really intrigues me, you say, quote, that Kraus used the concept of Jewish anti-Semitism in speaking of the Zionists. So what was the logic there, or could you explain for me how Kraus charged the Zionist enterprise itself with having an element of anti-Semitism?
Well, Karl Kraus is the most important satirist in Vienna. He's a Jew. He is very publicly a Jew. And he becomes very early on one of the most important opponents to Herzl and to Zionism. And he becomes an opponent to Zionism because what he sees the Zionists doing is refusing to acknowledge the value of Jewish life and culture in the Western diaspora, that is, in Vienna. Um, and what he says is that you demean the Jews who live in Vienna, and you want to invent a Jew that doesn't exist now, and you want that Jew to be in Palestine. And so he becomes both a defender of the Jew in the Western diaspora, but also an opponent of the notion of this kind of imaginary muscle Jew that early Zionism wants to yet create.
Okay. Theodore Lessing comes up, of course, and is an important individual in all this. And you note that Lessing's view of the Eastern Jew was so much in line with anti-Semitic caricatures of his time that sections of his reportage appeared in various anti-Semitic journals. Yeah. Could you address him?
Well, the Jewish journalist and historiographer Theodor Lessing published a book which was called Jewish Self-Hatred, which is where obviously I borrow my title from as a kind of homage to Theodor Lessing. And what Lessing is interested in is trying to identify this model. He takes a look at a half a dozen figures. But Lessing himself has a kind of ambivalent notion of who Jews are and what Jews are supposed to be. Because as critical as Lessing is of acculturated Jews, like Karl Marx, he is equally critical of the Eastern European Jew, who he sees as, in a sense, beyond the pale. That is, whom he sees as primitive, illiterate, and simple-minded. And that tension is quite interesting because Lessing sees, on the one hand, the pitfalls of acculturation, of over-identification. But he doesn't see that creating this fantasy of the Eastern Jew. By the way, Eastern Jews were of enormous diversity, from the intellectuals of Warsaw to the farmers and peasants of the Pale. He doesn't see this as, in a sense, being able. He doesn't see this as in any way contradictory.
You know, you say with the rise of the Nazis, the image of the self-hating Jew, the self-critical Jew, became a touchstone for the political anti-Semites. And you say the same thing about Lessing, which is to say, Jewish individuals in the self-hatred realm became useful to disseminate anti-Semitic views. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, one of the things that happens, certainly starting in the 19 teens and 20s, is that the critiques by Jews of what are labeled as Jewish self-haters become quoted over and over again by the right wing, by the proto-fascists, and then by the Nazi press. In a sense, it becomes a way that the Nazi press can prove the existence of these marginal and destructive figures. If Jews say this about Jews, it must be true, is the sort of argument, rather than this is just the problem of stereotyping, and stereotyping by individual Jews, seeing Jews as a projection of their own anxiety.
Could you, in your opening chapter, you talk about a number of things. Well, the hidden language, and you've touched upon this in various pieces, but as part of your title, could you kind of summarize what the hidden language means?
Well, part of Western European fantasies about Jews is that Jews are inordinately plastic. That is, they mold themselves to whatever circumstances they find themselves in, so that a Jew can be everyone, everywhere, all the time. But by becoming an Englishman, by becoming a German, by becoming a Frenchman, the Jew shows his inherent inauthenticity. And the proof of this is often in the claims about the way that Jews speak German or French or English. That is, if you listen careful enough, you know that the person may look English, may dress English, may eat English, but when they speak English, they speak it not quite authentically enough. And that notion of the Jews, in a sense, being malleable, being theatrical, being able to play all roles, is undermined in this anti Semitic view by the notion that there's always a clue that they're really, in the end, Jews.
And the Jewish individual internalizes all this?
Well, one of the things that certainly happens, again, from the Middle Ages on, is that this notion of the inauthenticity of the Jewish command, of the Jews, the individual Jews' command of any given language, becomes, in point of fact, part of the anxiety oftentimes about Jewish writers who are writing in German, who only have German, who are writing in English, who only have English, who are writing in French, who only have English, who only have French. And then the question is their German, is their French, is their English authentic, or is it somehow or another Jewish?
Um, to pop over, I looked at Freud, the Gender and Race, read some of that. Um, could you discuss Sigmund Freud's role in all your analyses, and particularly Freud's Jewish identity? I know that's a controversial issue. It's
Yeah.
a lot of people read about.
Well, I'm interested in Sigmund Freud because Freud comes up with a way of understanding the unconscious, which provides a sort of model for understanding those individuals who have over identified with the aggressor. This is part of what we call ego psychology. How do I create myself in the world? And one of the ways I create myself in the world is by taking bits and pieces of the world into me. Now, Freud also understands that this form of taking the world into you can be done through repression, which means it is the source of symptoms, of real symptoms, um, both psychic and somatic, symptoms of the mind and symptoms of the body. But he also understands that it can also be undertaken through what he calls sublimation, which is to take this and to turn it into things like works of art. That is, it can be one of the sources for great creativity. And I make an argument that Freud himself is a great example of sublimation. Here is this young child from Eastern Europe, from Bohemia, who is taken to Vienna, is raised a Western Jew, becomes a scientist. And becoming a scientist, especially becoming a medical scientist in the end of the 19th century, was to accept a whole range of notions of what a Jew was like, the illness of the Jews, the hysteria of the Jews, which is in all of his textbooks that he studies as a young physician. And he then has to deal with this, and he deals with this through sublimation, What he does is to create a way of understanding all human beings based on his own dealing with his own internalization of the world in which he finds himself.
Why are so many Jews so prominent in the fields of psychoanalysis, psychiatry, and so forth? You talked about that a little bit too. Jung, you brought up Jung,
Yeah.
who just calls it a Jewish science.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, it's interesting because the question is whether or not there is a kind of um, over representation of Jews in a range of the so-called helping professions in the 19th century. In medicine, in psychology, by the way, also in law. Um, Part of the answer for that is a purely technical one, which is in order to become a physician, in order to become a psychologist, in order to become a lawyer, all you had to do was to go to university. And once Jews were admitted to universities, these were professions they could enter into. It wasn't like inheriting a bank. In order to inherit a bank, your dad had to have a bank, right? In order to become a doctor, you had to go to university and study. Now, there was great hesitation of letting Jews in to universities in the 1840s and 1850s. But by the end of the century, Jews and then even women, right, in that order, Jewish men and then women, were admitted to become physicians. Um, is there an overabundance of Jews in, for example, psychoanalysis? Well, certainly in Vienna there is. But if you move to London, in the British Psychoanalytic Society, there are virtually no Jews. And that had to do with the composition of who were physicians in London as opposed to who were physicians in Vienna.
Somewhere here I have you talk about in the 1880s, psychopathology and Jews were terms that were connected.
Yeah.
Could you discuss that?
Well, certainly one of the things that Freud reacts to is that by the end of the 19th century, every standard textbook of psychiatry sees Jews, and now this is a big category, they simply talk about the Jews, as being predisposed to a whole range of mental illnesses, from schizophrenia, from dementia precox, through to hysteria. The Jews were seen as an ill people. They were physically ill, they were mentally ill. Now, statistically, this is the age of statistical reasoning, is when statistics becomes important. You can make this argument based on the figures that are presented. But these figures, of course, are based on partial samples and on a world in which statistical reasoning doesn't quite grasp the notion also of stereotyping, because one can project the notion of mental illness onto groups without the groups being clearly constituted in the world.
In the realm of Freud and all this, what role does circumcision play in the psychological realm of the Jewish identity by both Jews and non-Jews? And as a physical marker, the outsider, all that.
Well, one of the things that Christ says in the Gospels is, I have come not to change the law a jot or a tittle. But of course, Paul changes the law a lot. And one of the things he abandons, which Jesus did not abandon, was the ritual of circumcision. For the Greeks, circumcision was an anathema. It was a mutilation of the body. And Paul, who preached to the Greeks, saw that circumcision was not going to work if it was made a requirement for all Christians. That notion that the Jewish body, therefore, the circumcised body, is deviant, is ill, is mutilated, becomes a red thread, and it becomes a red thread up through the 20th century. I'm even going to argue the 21st century. There's a great anti-circumcision movement even in the 21st century. Certainly in the 19th century, the notion of circumcision as marking the Jewish body, and that marked body is aware as an adult of his difference from every other person's body, every other man's body, becomes a litmus test for physical difference. Freud writes about it in the case of little Hans. He wonders, why is it that this little child is so anxious about being castrated. And he says, well, in a sense, there's been a kind of quasi mutilation already with circumcision. Maybe the idea is not so weird if you're a child to imagine that something else could happen. Now, that is Freud's fantasy. That is Freud's fantasy. But certainly there's a real anxiety about infant male circumcision among the Jews in the 19th and 20th century. What fascinates me, of course, is that the Jews are not the only people to do infant male circumcisions. Muslims do too. And it's interesting to me in the 20th century that there is no equivalent anxiety about the Muslim body in the West. Many other reasons, but not in terms of circumcision.
You have a quote here. Freud provided the reader with a major case study of laughter as a means of expiating Jewish self-hatred. Did you discuss humor?
Well, Freud's theory on humor um, is a general theory. I mean, he picks up Kant's question about why people laugh, and Kant says, well, it's because of surprise. And Freud says, yeah, it's surprise, but it has to do with the rising up from the unconscious of certain things that have been censored. The example he uses, and he says at the end of his 1905 joke book on humor, that the best jokes to analyze are Jewish jokes. And one of the things that becomes interesting is that in the course of the 19th century, the Jews become a people with humor. Now, I don't mean individual Jews. I'm sure individual Jews from Moses on had a sense of humor. But the notion was that if you wanted to become respectable as a group in the 19th century, you had to learn to laugh at yourself. It was one of the kind of litmus tests for belonging. And Freud in the joke book very much picks up on this notion that you can tell jokes as a way of showing your own acceptance of your status in society. And Freud's book of analyzing humor is a classic example of how science then is put to the test of trying to analyze what it also presents, which is how do you become part of the human race? Well, one of the ways of becoming part of the human race is acknowledging laughter and yourself as the object, but also the teller of jokes. Um, and that is something which is both, for Freud, universal, but also very Jewish.
Do you know, and I'll ask you this now, I don't expect you to come up with a response right away, but maybe related. Do you know any Jewish jokes that epitomize the issue of self-hatred or anti-Semitism in that realm?
Well, the classic joke that Freud tells, right, is that two Jews meet outside of a bathhouse. And the one Jew says to the other, have you taken a bath? And the Jew responds, why is one missing? Right? That's the joke that Freud tells. Now, what's interesting is that that's a joke that appears in the most vicious anti-Semitic um, magazine in Vienna, a magazine called Kikeriki, about a decade before Freud puts it into his joke book. It's a joke at that point in which there's a caricature of Eastern European Jews. And one of the things one can do is to say that when Freud tells that joke, which is a joke about uncleanliness and about not having the kind of social and mores of being a Western civilized human being, is that Freud too tells that joke, even though it's not explicitly about Eastern Jews, about Eastern Jews. And remember that Freud is both an Eastern Jew, he's born in Bohemia, and he's a Western Jew. He lived, raised in Vienna. So that's a joke that he tells about himself to an audience of other Jews who would laugh.
So that joke essentially is an internalized anti-Semitism?
Well, I think it's a projected anti-Semitism. I think the bathhouse joke is a form of projected anti-Semitism, which is because what it says is that we Western Jews, that we Western Jews are clean. We know what cleanliness is. We know that cleanliness is next to godliness. The Eastern European Jews are people for whom bathing is both ritual and unusual.
What is the meaning, man? I mean, I'm asking you
Yeah.
talk general questions, but I just like to see where you go with it. What is your sense of the meaning of? I've heard this Jewish joke in various versions. There's something like if you've got three Jews in a room, you've got four opinions, or eight opinions, or 40 opinions. Do you have any take on what that's about?
Well, I mean, again, it strikes me that the notion that the Jews are um, opinionated, that they are argumentative uh, as a category, right? The Jews as a stereotype is an interesting one because it is part of a stereotype which you have in Germany already in the 17th century that is called the Jews' school, the Judenschule. And we have caricatures of this. The notion is that while good Protestants are obvious in terms of their demeanor, right? They're polite and they're organized in their religious presence. Jews are chaotic. They are argumentative. Now, again, there may be Jews who are argumentative, and there may be Jews who are terribly passive. But the idea of the Judenschule, of the Jews' school, was that it was by definition the antithesis of the Protestant church. And that's really of interest to me because you get this over and over and over again that the Jews are by definition a chaotic and argumentative people. Um, when in point of fact, what you may have is the notion that some Jews may be questioning, and that's very different than being argumentative. So I think the stereotype of Jewish argumentativeness is an interesting one, and it has a history.
What about the stereotype of the Jew as a rebel or a revolutionary rebel? The whole realm of being out, the outsider aspect again. How does that play in all this?
Well, again, the Jew is certainly in the 19th century both the essential banker and the essential anarchist. That is, the Jew is everything that you don't like. You pick the category, and the Jew as a stereotype can be fitted into it. The line that is used, and I use it myself, is why is it that so many communists at the time of the Russian Revolution were Jews, and so few Jews in Russia were actually communists? That is, the Jews remained very distant from the Communist Party, by the way, all the way through because of the innate anti-Semitism of the Communist Party. That Jews are leaders is true, but the actual leadership of the Communist Party in the revolution is not Jewish at all, because neither Lenin nor Stalin are Jews.
There's much reference in the Jewish community to collective memory. Do you have any speculations on that? What that means, and does it have any relevance to what we're talking about here?
Well, certainly this question of collective memory, which is a good 19th century term, is one that is applied to the notion that the Jews have a common history. And again, the Jews is a stereotype, because if you take Northern African Jews and you take Australian Jews and you take Jews from Alaska, the answer is there is no collective memory. There is certainly for religious Jews a common text, which provides an argument for the text as memory, and that's the Old Testament. Um, but if you're looking at Jews who are not religious Jews, their common memory may be that of their ethnic background, it may be of their local experience. It certainly won't be Jewish in the universal notion, because this notion of a universal collective memory is part of a stereotype in which all Jews have a single unifying characteristic.
Let me ask you, in your view, what does modern Israel mean to Jews today, in terms of all this we're talking about?
Yeah. Well, Israel, of course, has multiple functions in the world. It is a religious homeland. It is a political homeland. Um, with the growing number of Israelis in the diaspora, it becomes a place you grew up with and then left, rather than a place you might want to someday go to. So there are as many different Israels in the world as there are the need for these Israels. Some of them positive, by the way, some of them negative.
Okay, I read that. I remember you saying that in the book or online. The idea and your view that Israel itself has become part of the diaspora, that there's a movement out of that,
Yeah.
which is sort of a subversion of the original ideas of Zionism, right? Could you elaborate on that?
Well, certainly Israel in this sense has become a modern state, much like every other modern state in which people emigrate and people immigrate. Um, People are illegal in Israel. There is a big debate now about Somalis, refugees in Israel. And there are huge numbers of Israelis who, over the last decades, have emigrated and form now Israeli communities throughout the world, as there are American communities throughout the world and Chinese communities throughout the world. What is fascinating to me is that the goal of Zionism was to create a normal Jewish state. But a normal state is something always in flux, always changing. So the notion that a normal Jewish state would be a necessary space for the ingathering of all Jews, right, which is part of an ideology of the late 19th century, not just Herzl, but many of the forerunners of Herzl, has turned out to be, in a sense, inaccurate, even though huge numbers of Jews have gone to Israel. A number of them that went to Israel returned, went elsewhere, and a number of Jews born in Israel, Sabras, have now emigrated. So, in other words, in real terms, Israel is simply a normal state.
Um, Another big question. It's a wild and
Now,
unwieldy, but do you have any speculations on the future of Israel?
again, I'm a historian, so
Okay.
speculations on the future.
Well,
You
even in
know,
the cycle, even in terms we're talking
no,
about.
I mean,
No. Okay.
again, I'm real good in the past.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. No. No. Okay. You mentioned in the book Kudahis, Ordeal of Civility,
yeah.
and could you discuss what that issue is about? I mean, my sense is it has to do with the Protestant so-called civility alleged, and the Jewish alleged lack of it. Could you address that?
Well, one of the things that happens certainly in Central Europe is the notion of how do you become a German. Remember, Germany is a very, very, very recent state. It was founded in the 1870s out of a whole range of states, some of them Catholic and some of them Protestant, who'd fought a very long religious war after the Protestant Revolution, Protestant Reformation. So one of the things that one can really look at is how the idea of Germanness, of the stereotype of what it meant to be a German, is constituted. And one of the things that it comes out of it is the notion that Germans are civil. That is, that Germans are agreeable, that they see common goals, and that they are good bourgeois. In the course of the 19th century, the Jew became the antithesis for the German. As the Germans tried to bring the Catholic and the Protestants together in this new state, the Jew became the antithesis. So if the Germans were civil, sort of a Protestant notion of getting along together, playing the game by the rules, the Jews were seen as uncivil, not playing by the rules. The joke, of course, is that in the course of the 19th century, as the Germans were becoming Germans, right, between 1800 and 1870, the Jews were becoming civilly emancipated and were becoming Germans also. And how do you become German? Is to become more and more civil. So one of the guidelines for Reform Judaism was that it was the most civil of all religions, right? So the joke, of course, is in this antithesis between German and Jew, is that by the time Germany is a state, the Jews in Germany have bought into certain Protestant notions of what it means to be a good German citizen. And many people of the time said that the German Jews, or at least many of the German Jews, were the best citizens because they believed in, with no hesitation, in the goals of that new Germany, of that new German identity and that new German state, with the exception, of course, is that they wanted to remain Jews rather than becoming either Catholics or Protestants.
How does Jewish achievement, I mean, what it, there's quite a bit of it, fit in your model of being the outsider, social acceptance, and maybe even self-hatred, all
Yeah.
those issues?
Well, one of the real myths that we have in the West, and it's a myth that goes back certainly to the 16th and 17th century, is the myth of Jewish superior intelligence, the myth of greater Jewish capability. Um, and the answer, of course, is that if you look at the totality of experience of individual Jews, some of them are successful and some of them are not successful. If you are, however, outside the norm in reality or in terms of the group's fantasy, um, you have to work harder to become part of the norm. And so one of the things that we begin to see is the ability of Jews to excel in fields which they are admitted to. And I'll give you a wonderful example of this. There's a discussion both in the United States and in Germany in the 19th and 20th century about the overrepresentation of Jews in the medical profession. In Germany, this discussion takes place right around the First World War, and by the 1920s in the United States, there are quotas in admitting Jews to universities, but especially to medical schools, because of the great number of Jews who wanted to become physicians. Well, Jewish normalization over the last 20 to 30 years in the United States has meant that there's been a great drop in the number of self-identified Jews now applying to medical school. That is, as Jews can get into medicine, as in point of fact they're successful in getting into medicine, as in point of fact they make the point that they can function, it's not interesting for great numbers to get into medicine. But it doesn't mean there's not another group in the wings, because the oversupply, the overabundance, the greater percentage of Jews in the schools of medicine are now being replaced by East Asians and South Asians, by Chinese, Japanese, and Indians, Indian Americans, Chinese American, Japanese Americans. Um, my wager is that that shift, which we've seen radically over the last 20 years, will also play itself out over time. But this has nothing to do with Jewish ability. This has to do with the sociology of outgroups, especially immigrant outgroups, and how they integrate themselves into a society.
Can I ask a few more? I mean,
I'm getting tired, so
I'll wind it up then?
let's wind it up then.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry.
No, you've been profoundly generous.
Good.
The stereotypes of Jews and money. Do you discuss
Yeah.
that, Larry? That's the classic.
Well, the classic notion is that Jews, in point of fact, have a special affinity to capital. And there's a really interesting historical reason for this. The Catholic Church in the 12th and 13th century forbade Christians from taking interest on loans. And the rationale, which was very clear, was that money, gold, silver, is inanimate, right? It's not living, and therefore could not reproduce. It was therefore immoral to have something which is inanimate reproduce. Now, to be brutal about it, every society has to have capital. Even in a pre-capitalist society in the late Middle Ages, you needed to have capital. So there had to be somebody in the society who could lend money. The Jews, who were not obviously covered by canon law, they were beyond the pale, they had their own laws, were given therefore the permission, and by the way, were penalized regularly to take interest. That is, to lend money and to take interest on money. It was a theological, historical fluke that bound the notion of the Jew to the notions of capital. This, by the way, is not the case earlier. It's very interesting. But it becomes a very powerful case, even at a point, by the way, with the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, where that requirement that Christians do not take interest is abandoned. But the notion that Jews have a special relationship to capital, even though by the 19th century most of the great banks of Europe or run by non-Jews and not Jews, um, is one of the kind of interesting historical stereotypes that Jews are avaricious, that they have a special relationship to money. I'll point out to you that they're not the only groups so seen. The Scots are perhaps the other one that is best known in the United States, that the Scots are seen as being tight and being avaricious. But I think that if you look at any national group, you will find that some other in that group is always seen as being somehow or another less generous than the group itself.
You talk about the Diary of Anne Frank and how it was initially portrayed as a universalistic uh, portrayal, and that eventually became a Jewish particularist one.
Yeah.
And you talk about Meyer Levin, his views about it all. And would you elaborate on Diary of Anne Frank, please?
Well, when the Diary of Anne Frank was first published, and first then in Dutch and then in English, it was of course edited. Otto Frank edited a rather long document, and when it was presented in English, it was read, if it was read at all, as a kind of document of a young girl. When it was decided to put the diary on stage and then subsequently in film, the screenplay moved this from being the diary of a young Jewish girl to being a universal story of a young person, and almost eliminated completely any Jewish reference. I mean, it became very difficult to understand why these people were in hiding from the Nazis. This became very contentious, and certainly about 10 years ago, when the whole diary was finally published, with all of the passages that had been redacted out, basically because of length, and also some of them because they were very personal by Anne Frank's father, was the Jewish aspect was kind of foregrounded. And what's interesting now is that Anne Frank is not seen as a kind of universal figure. She's seen as the kind of exemplary figure of the Holocaust and of the Jews in the Holocaust.
Just ask one last question,
Sure.
and that's just I have not looked at Smart Jews,
Yeah.
but I suspect you subvert the notion. Could you just synopsize?
Well, I've written, in a sense, I already have, because I think this question of the myth of Jewish superior intelligence is one which either serves as a cudgel to beat up Jews who are not really all that smart, they're just clever, right? It's an anti-Semitic slash philo-Semitic stereotype of the Jews, to being a way of talking about a kind of Jewish particularity, oftentimes as a kind of genetic quality rather than as a social quality. Immigrants, especially immigrants who are fleeing persecution, tend to work harder because they know they've got to work harder. Once they become established in a society, that work ethos becomes the work ethos of the general society. The example can be the radical drop off over the last 20 years in the number of self-identified Jews entering medical school. Jews were overrepresented 30 years ago. They're underrepresented now, but Asian Americans now are overrepresented. New immigrant group. Are we going to speak about the smart Chinese? Maybe we already do.